Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dalaran, and recently we've got some more news about what Blizzard might be doing potentially with PvP. There's a couple different things that Blizzard wants to do, like adding new honor talents, maybe doing an update for some honor talents that are not that good and improving on them, or maybe even removing certain honor talents that don't really get a lot of picks and give classes different honor talents to play with. Another big change that they want to do is continue on the class improvement and scaling and balancing and tuning, which are all good things, but it turns out Blizzard is actually maybe even thinking about doing a WoD style gear scaling for player versus player content going into future patches. In this video, I just want to discuss what that would look like, what the WoD scaling was like, talk about the advantages to the system and disadvantages, because I think a lot of you guys at PvP would be interested in how would the scaling work, because we're just coming off the tail end of BFA scaling and not a lot of people like that. So let's first start with the difference between this scaling for WoD as well as the BFA scaling. BFA scaling was very similar to Legion. In Legion, you didn't really need specific pieces of gear, you just needed an item level. And then the game kind of gave you your haste, agility, versatility, mastery, all those stats based on just how good your item level is. As long as it had high item level, it just kind of gave you the stats you needed. Going into Battle for Azeroth, we had scaling, but a lot more of it. Now you can actually kind of sort of affect your class in terms of what stats you want, what gear you run, which trinkets you use. However, there were pretty early signs of issues with the scaling system from the beginning of the Battle for Azeroth alpha and the beta. Once Azerite gear started to get introduced for us to test, which wasn't really there for too long, players already found a way to break the scaling. For one reason or another, if your character were to be naked head to toe and only wearing the necklace for Heart of Azeroth, the helmet, shoulders and chest piece that are Azerite gear, and that's the only thing you wore, for some reason or another, you would take a lot of damage, which makes sense because you're not wearing a lot of stuff, but you also would deal a lot of damage. You could 2-shot, 3-shot players, and if you're a class like a rogue that had the early game advantage to be able to sap the enemy and open up with full cooldowns available at the start, you were actually legit unbeatable. Another aspect of the system that was just roughly broken was the fact that if, let's say, you hit an enemy with an ability, like a warlock hits another player with a chaos bolt, the number that you see on your screen for that chaos bolt is different than what the person getting slammed by your chaos bolt sees. So let's say if your chaos bolt hits somebody for 10k, the person might be hit for like 8k or 7k, because it would be kind of like percentage based sort of kind of, but not really. Like, it was all kinds of whack, and not a lot of people really liked it. Once people started figuring out that that's how the whole scaling system works, people began to really dislike it. However, the WoD scaling that they're talking about in some of the interviews is a little bit different. The WoD scaling only has to do with the WoD gear. Depending on what content you're in, the item level of your items would be higher or lower, particularly higher if you are inside of PvP situations. So as an example to have on Wowhead, if you had the very basic gear that started out at 625 item level inside of PvP like Battlegrounds and Arenas, it would jump up to item level 700. Honor gear would start at 670 and jump to 710, and the Conquest gear would start at 700 for PvE and be 730 in PvP. The system accomplished a specific goal. They wanted to make PvP gear the best for PvP, all without having to necessarily establish any kind of PvP specific stat, where this PvP gear could still be used in PvE content, like the Honor gear and the Conquest gear, like the item level isn't all that bad, but it's scaled differently for PvP content like BGs and Arenas, whereas Dungeon and Raid gear did not have the same functionality. Another thing you will notice is actually the scaling in PvP for gear will end up being completely different. For PvE, the item levels would be up to 75 item levels apart. That's a lot of item levels, that's a pretty big distance to cover. But inside of PvP, the maximum item level difference you would have had is 30 at most. So the Honor gear, base gear established a minimum item level, and the Conquest gear established a maximum item level. It also allowed for players that only PvP and only want to gear through PvP a simple and easy path. Just collect as much PvP gear as you can, because all of it will end up scaling and won't be really that low of an item level. I mean, you'll be jumping from 625 item level to 700. That's a pretty big jump, and all it takes is just wearing a base set of gear without having to worry about if you're running the right stats, if you're running the wrong stats. It's a PvP set. Even if it's very basic, it is going to be the best choice for me if I want to PvP. The scaling also kind of bridged the gap between the most geared players and the least geared players, as the item level within PvE would have been 75 item level apart. I mean, a 20 item level difference in Shadowlands is massive. You're going from doing kind of decent damage to you're just one-shotting players left and right, especially if they're mildly undergeared. So they bridged that gap of 75 item levels to only 30, which kind of cut the power of it in half, allowed players that, let's say, are brand new to the game or are not really all that great in PvP or played casually to always have an opportunity to take that first step into the arena, first step through that door and be introduced to that kind of content, because the gear wouldn't really hold you too far back, or the lack thereof gear wouldn't really hold you super far back. I know we've just came out of Battle for Azeroth scaling and people didn't like that. However, if Blizzard were to bring in a WoD style scaling, I would definitely hope that it's only for the gear pieces. It doesn't affect classes or how classes play. Having gear scale, I think it's on a whole nother level than having classes scale, which was the biggest problem back in BFA. It's interesting that Blizzard is actually thinking about doing a WoD style scaling, because I would even argue right now the best ways and the fastest ways to gear for any character is by doing PvP. I would say that RBGs and reaching a higher rank in RBGs right now is a little bit easier, and getting that 226 gear is far easier than doing some of the boss fights inside of Mythic raids. Hell, Mythic bosses don't really give you the gear until 905 updates with the Valor points, and hopefully there will be more updates. But right now, out of all the different avenues, I would argue that PvP gearing is probably the fastest way and the easiest to gear up all our characters right now. So it's interesting that Blizzard wants to do more help towards the PvP side of the game, where PvP seems the fastest way of gearing. I wonder if they're trying to make it the PvP gear becomes more exclusive for PvP here. If that is the case, there will be some advantages and disadvantages to that system change. PvP gear offers you a lot of versatility and some great trinkets that are usable in PvE as well, and they actually are great. A lot of tanks like PvP gear because it offers so much versa, allowing tanks to survive a lot of the dungeon and raid situations, making them less of a kite tank and rather just taking damage to the face like a real tank would. Second question would be, is Blizzard thinking of potentially in future patches decreasing the item level of PvP gear because it will scale within PvP content, but outside of PvP, BGs, War Mode, will it be a lower item level than raid dungeon gear? If that is the case, then I think it would kind of make sense to kind of give PvPers a PvP set and kind of give less incentive for someone who just wants to raid or someone who just wants to dungeons to want to have to do any of the PvP stuff. I love PvP in WoW. I've always enjoyed it. I always thought it was very unique, but there's a lot of guildies of mine that just want to PvE, that don't really care that much about stepping foot into arena or doing RBGs. They feel like they have to do it because that's where the easiest way to gear their characters might be, but it would eliminate some of those issues for PvPers to have to do dungeons. They just have to do PvP, and for anybody who does dungeons and raids and non-PvP content to just do non-PvP content. Or would Blizzard keep the same item level of all those PvP pieces and just have them scale to a much higher level, just to kind of balance out the lower end and the higher end of PvP, because that's another thing that should be considered. There's quite a lot of people that are trying to climb their first bits of rating and they're getting the Conquest gear for the first time, and let's say they're trying to climb into the 1400 and 1600, and while that might not be a challenging rating for a lot of you, for some players it is the first time they've actually seen that bracket. And when they're climbing to that 1600, they're running into dudes who rolled into dungeons as well as raids, walking out with 226 pieces, just obliterating players, since gear now makes a difference and scaling isn't part of the game, where you actually can one-shot players and can be super under-geared. Because scaling then of WoD style would bridge the gap between the high end and the low end of players that are geared, and it would allow players that are just getting into PvP or play it casually or not that great to not be at a complete disadvantage against a player that's actually geared. There's a lot of questions behind this kind of system, and right now we just don't have the answers because this information just came out. But it is definitely an interesting topic. I thought that we should open up a discussion on this channel. But thank you guys so much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed. Let me know your thoughts about a potential WoD style scaling for Shadowlands. Is it a good idea? Do you think so? Do you think not? And why? Thank you so much for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. And as always, I'll see all of you guys in another video.